Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 36 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we've been doing a bit of study into Tolkien's circle of literary friends, the Inklings. And we started last week by looking at Humphrey Carpenter's excellent and eponymous book, The Inklings. Let's pick up where we left off last time when Tolkien founded a club to read old Icelandic sagas. As Carpenter writes, Tolkien had decided to form a club among the Dons to read Icelandic sagas and myths. Among his proposals for syllabus reform was the suggestion that Old Icelandic, also known as Old Norse, should be given a more prominent place among early and medieval studies, at least for the specialists. And he thought that the best way to proselytize would be to show his colleagues how enjoyable the reading of Icelandic can be. So the Kolbítars came into existence. Their Icelandic name was Kolbítar, a jesting term meaning men who lounge so close to the fire in winter that they bite the coal. Now, he started the club in the spring of 1926, and Carpenter lists its initial members, some of whom had a pretty solid knowledge of Icelandic to begin with, but others, as Carpenter puts it, were ignorant and were merely enthusiastic beginners. Now, that group included Neville Coghill, who would best be known for his modern English version of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Others included John Bryson, an English tutor at Balliol College, George Gordon, the professor of English literature and Tolkien's former department head at Leeds, along with C.S. Lewis. Now, Carpenter explains that the suggestion that Lewis be invited to join may have come from John Bryson, a fellow Ulsterman, or from George Gordon, who had taught Lewis as an undergraduate and had been influential in getting him the Magdalen Fellowship. Gordon was a great intriguer and campaigner. He had also had a hand in Tolkien's election as professor of Anglo-Saxon. Or maybe it was Tolkien himself who discovered that Lewis was keen to join the club. At all events, by January 1927, Lewis was attending the Kolbítar and was finding it invigorating. Well, come on! Who wouldn't find it invigorating to read Icelandic sagas with Tolkien and the rest of the Kolbítars? So what that Lewis couldn't read more than a word or two without a dictionary? I certainly couldn't. As Carpenter writes, Tolkien, who was of course expert in the language, shocker, and knew the text well, would improvise a perfect translation of perhaps a dozen pages. Then those with some knowledge of the language would do a page or so each. Finally, the beginners, including Lewis and Coghill, would try to work their way through a paragraph or so, leaning on Tolkien for help when needed. Now, not surprisingly, Lewis loved it. Carpenter explains, "For someone who had been devoted to Norse myths and legends since adolescence, it was exhilarating to be reading them in the original language." Spent the morning partly on the Edda, Lewis wrote in his diary in February 1927. The Kolbítars were working their way through the Younger Edda, which contains a version of the great Norse myths. Hammered my way through a couple of pages in about an hour, but I am making some headway. It is an exciting experience when I remember my first passion for things Norse under the initiation of Longfellow. It seemed impossible then that I should ever come to read these things in the original. The old, authentic thrill came back to me once or twice this morning, the mere names of god and giant catching my eye. Interestingly, though they met regularly throughout the terms of school, it wasn't until 3 years later before Lewis came to discover that he shared that same love of Norse mythology with Tolkien. In December 1929, Lewis wrote to Arthur Greeves, "One week I was up till 2:30 on Monday talking to the Anglo-Saxon professor Tolkien, who came back with me to college from a society and sat discoursing of the gods and giants of Asgard for 3 hours, then departing in the wind and rain. Who could turn him out? For the fire was bright and the talk good." As Carpenter says, it was the beginning of a friendship. The moment, as Lewis once remarked, when someone who has till then believed his feelings to be unique cries out, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." You know, in some ways, the Tolkien fandom feels like that too, doesn't it? And you'll be talking with somebody about something else, maybe just mythology or fantasy in general, or maybe books or language. And then you'll discover that they are passionate about Middle-earth and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's a, "What, you too?" moment. I love that. Folks, that wraps it up for today's Tolkien Tuesday. Please join me again next week as we read more about Tolkien's love of northernness and his early forays into Middle-earth, especially in early December 1929, when Tolkien shares the tale of Beren and Luthien with Lewis. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join the Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe on your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.